It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And today we are doing Trouble and Her Friends by Melissa Scott. This is another retro Wizards versus Lesbians, as you could probably tell from the intro jingle. We are back in 1994, a simpler time in many respects.
Another classic of the Wizards versus Lesbians proto-genre.
Yes, indeed. And this book is a cyberpunk novel, which is set in far future 1994. Alexis, do you want to do the plot, or shall I?
I'll take a stab at it. So, India Carlos, aka Trouble, is a cool cyberpunk hacker with a cool cyberpunk hacker girlfriend. And the book opens when they have just broken up because some special brain hacking legislation has just passed the Senate and has overridden the president's veto. And now cyberspace is no longer going to be nearly so fun, particularly not for gay people. And then several years later, a new hacker is in town claiming to be Trouble, but is not behaving with, Trouble's circumspection. And so Trouble's ex-girlfriend, Cerise, as well as Trouble herself, now have to try to track down new Trouble and get them to stop dragging old Trouble's name through the mud and bringing the agents of the Treasury after them.
Indeed. And this requires them to journey to the hacker...
the hacker paradise of Sea Haven, one of which... The two hacker paradises of Sea Haven, one of which is in cyberspace, and the other of which is in New Hampshire.
Indeed. I was going to mention that the hacker paradise is in New Hampshire, which I thought was kind of hilarious. You kind of have to put that together from clues.
It says it's in New Hampshire.
Oh, it does? I missed that part. I was looking at the rivers that they cross and the various other, geographical features they were.
It says straight up that it's in New Hampshire.
Ah, well, wasted effort then, but at least I know exactly where in New Hampshire it is
true.
now. It's Hampton, New Hampshire, in case you wanted to know. Any dang way. See here. Why should you read this book? Oh, Wizards, Lesbians? Yes, both.
Yes, both.
This is actual Wizards versus Lesbians.
This is in some ways more Wizards versus Lesbians than some of the modern Wizards versus Lesbians books that we do.
True, which came as a pleasant surprise since we sort of both vaguely remembered what this book was about. And
I remembered that there was a wizard.
Indeed. I didn't even remember that because my memory is the worst, but... it really sets up a lot of themes that, we might expect to see in more detail later on. Regardless, that's for post-spoiler zone. So why should you read this book?
It's fun.
It is fun.
If you want old Neil Stephenson or old William Gibson stuff, but with lesbians and less racism.
Yep.
That's mostly, I call it a Neil Stephenson. That's, this is great. This is a lot of fun. This won a Lambda Award. This really is just classic cyberpunk, but lesbians.
Indeed. It won a Lambda Award, so it's the second Lambda Award-winning book that we have read.
This is also this was published a year before The Fortunate Fall, so apparently there was just this, brief moment in the 90s when Tor was putting out lesbian cyberpunk, and then...
I think there was a year in the 90s when everybody was putting out anything that was even vaguely cyberpunk, and then it vanished like disco into the...
into the ether.
Into the ether, yep. Jinx. That's 2 Cokes to go against the million that I already owe you. Anyway, yes, I agree. I don't really have anything to add to that, except that it is really refreshing to me to read a book that is as wonkily structured and paced as this one. You could put that in the why not to read it category if that's going to annoy you, but I personally, after the last few that we've read, have just been like, it just, it's just a series of events, and it's kind of noiry and arty in the way that it starts and stops, and it doesn't fit any particular rubric. I am much more comfortable.
Yeah, no, I mean, this one, and I also note another reason why you should read this book is it's short.
Yes.
But yeah, no, this one has, because like it's reasonably fast paced. It moves along at a good clip, but and it's shorter than a lot of these books. But yeah, it is clearly not trying to contort itself into a sort of screenwriter mold. It's just it is telling a story. The model where every thread has to be scrupulously put back and called back to during your third act action fest is not present here. The book just stops, and if there are any mysteries left to unravel, you can worry about that yourself. It has a nice little denouement.
It does indeed.
This does not do a snow crash.
That is true, but it doesn't explain everything either.
No, because it turns out you don't need to explain everything.
Yes.
The world is a mysterious place, and science fiction and fantasy should reflect the fact that sometimes the world is just vast and inexplicable.
I'm letting off party poppers and dancing in the streets, carrying a banner with that written on it.
Right. I mean, that's, I think, part of why this book is, so, like, and this, it does good, it reveals things at a good pace. It doesn't, it explains things when they absolutely need to be explained. It lets, in just brief asides, it lets context clues explain things otherwise. It's fun, and it's fairly well constructed. And, if you miss if you want just a good cyberpunk that's 90s and is, and is interesting, but not the extremely ambitious bonkers mess that are beloved, that The Fortunate Fall, which we both loved, but which is bonkers. This is not that. This actually works as a novel.
This book is not going to be up for the Whale Award. There is no whale in this book.
No.
As to why shouldn't you read it, I would say it might make you sad in the same way that many of the 90s books that we've read make me sad, because there's a lot of things in here that, even though it's trying to imagine this horrible dystopian future, it's still weirdly optimistic about a lot of things in a way that
I spent the entire time reading this going, wow, suddenly I remember when the internet was weird and fun and not just like, right. 5 websites full of Nazis.
Do you remember when we imagined that Europe was this bastion of, progressive civilization that might eventually save us all?
No, actually. I went to a hippie school.
Yes.
But like...
Some of us thought that way.
But like, the idea that, I don't know. It was... It imagines this weird dystopia. Like a lot of 90s dystopia, you look at the dystopian future and you're like, wow, it actually turns out you were not, the things you thought were bad actually went away, most of them, but so many worse things rose up instead.
Yeah, so there's that. Just the prose can be a little clunky at times. It didn't, not in a way that bothered me too much.
But it's not.
This isn't like it ain't Shakespeare, folks. This is a fun little book,
right?
And let's see here.
It's honestly, and it's funny, when I first read it, I was like, this just feels a little bit sort of derivative. But rereading it, I actually feel like it is less. It's
derivative and more. It's prescient in some ways,
right? Exactly. And it in its when I first read it, which was 10 years ago, it felt, I was like, oh well, this is just somebody, read Snow Crash and Neuromancer and went, but lesbians. But actually, it's not that. And we can get more into that in the post-spoiler zone. So I will say that's a good reason why you should read it. I would say this is more
Gibson than Stevenson anyway.
It's definitely much more Gibson than Stevenson. Anyway, but it's also not just Gibson but lesbians.
Yes, and it also is actively reacting against certain elements of the Gibson-Stevenson type.
Right, exactly.
As we will discuss.
Yeah.
Content warnings, body modification, obviously, because it's cyberpunk, it's the 90s. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, plugging your brain directly into things.
Actually, there's some stuff that's sort of, I wouldn't quite call it dubious sexual consent, but there's definitely some deceptive practices to get people into bed. But people into cyber, like,
and some weird grooming stuff that isn't necessarily sexual, but is weird grooming stuff.
Yeah, there's weird grooming stuff. It's mostly mentioned as opposed to, it's not a viewpoint character. But it also, to give it credit,
I could still see finding the stuff with Silk pretty upsetting, honestly.
Oh, no, a lot of the stuff with Silk is pretty upsetting. What I'm saying is, it is not viewpoint or in detail, which is a useful thing to know. Also, though, it does not do the thing that some of the books we read do of, of sort of atrocities are happening, but not to anybody we care about. This is very clear-eyed about the badness of adults grooming, even when there is not necessarily any sexual element to it. Of abusing vulnerable young people. There's homophobia. There's a lot of homophobia.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it is, the society is homophobic and that's bad and it's happening to our characters. But yes, there's a lot of homophobia. And there's some sort of interesting sort of nascent transness stuff in there, which is true of all 90s cyberpunk as far as I can tell.
Yes. But I think it's handled, it doesn't come off as turfy at all.
Not at all. I was actually a little bit worried. But
right.
We'll get into that in a second.
Yeah.
But I hadn't noticed it the first time around, and I was relieved in the second time. But actually, why don't we go ahead and talk about that? And shall we go to the spoiler zone?
Let's go to the spoiler zone.
To ward off a case of diminishing returns, I'm gonna stick to guitar for this one. Spoiler zone. So yes, I was all prepared for Cerise to be horrified that she had been, that she had had sex with somebody who was actually a man. But I was incredibly relieved to be for a reaction to be it happens.
Right.
In fact, on the internet.
It is mentioned. It is mentioned a little bit later as a sort of a foreshadowing as to Silk's identity when Trouble is reflecting on Cerise, getting Cerise out of a variety of antics in the past, including, and there was that time that she accidentally had sex with a man. It's clearly Cerise just does this sometimes because she's a lesbian, but she's not one who vets her cyber partners very thoroughly. Yeah.
I actually really liked that whole section because Cerise's reaction afterwards was it wasn't the sort of over-egged horror that one might feel under.
It wasn't like, I've been deeply violated. It was, I've been hustled. Either somebody was trying to make a fool of me, in which case, I guess I'll have to deal with those. But I've been in dumber scrapes, or somebody was just toying with me. But whatever. I've been in dumber scrapes.
It felt like a refreshingly adult take on the situation. From somebody experienced also. It's clear that, Cerise has been around the block a few times.
I think one of the things that I really like about this book is that these people are clearly adults. They're probably in their early 30s is the impression I get. Maybe mid 30s.
But even, regardless of how old they are, they've also been on the internet forever, and been doing this forever. They probably got their start when they were really young. There's some, stuff about we had to run away from home because of X. These
Right.
people have seen shit.
Right.
They're all grown ups in that way.
Right. I mean, these are kids who clearly got, kicked out of their homes or had to run away from their homes for being queer. And then they found their weird little internet home with the other queer people on the internet. And then like a bunch of them moved to New York or Chicago or some other, probably New York. It's a city with a subway.
And it is close to New Hampshire.
And it is driving distance from New Hampshire. So it could also be Boston.
That narrows it down. Yeah, it could be Boston. I hope it's not Boston for their sakes.
Well, who knows what cyber Boston is like.
I'm shipping off to Boston, whoa. I'm shipping up to Boston, whoa. I'm shipping up to Boston, whoa. I'm shipping off to Jack and to the
And
worse would be my guess.
But and it's and so it means that while they're dealing, it's clear that they've dealt with a lot of stuff. It's great to sort of see these characters who were vulnerable queer kids at one point and still make a lot of bad decisions, but are like mostly experienced adults who are capable of handling the fallout from their bad decisions and like apologizing to each other.
Right. Exactly. It's like, oh, we've ended up having to sleep in our car on a toxic beach. Well, it wouldn't be the first time.
Right.
Let's have an adult conversation and then you can take a nap,
Right.
Because you're going to be tired tomorrow. So get some sleep,
Right.
I appreciate the sort of, they're not perhaps like mature people in,
no, but they're
depending on your definition of
but they've had enough life experience that they're capable, that like the sort of the emotions are toned down a little bit because, it is clear that everything that has happened in this book, worse has happened to them in the past. And now they're mostly just like, that life sometimes is just like that.
Yep.
Which I also,
I actually, sorry, I just glanced over at my notes and the sentence "all adults too, thank God" is written there. Right. So I was on the
right, including
I was on the same wavelength.
The way that they get back together felt really sort of realistic, where they're sort of flirting for a while and then they have a conversation where it's like, yeah, I'm really sorry, I apologize, and there's still some hurt feelings about it, but sort of it's believable that they can get back together because they talk it out.
Right, exactly. And then they're both like old enough to be like, this kind of physical connection is valuable. We'll just go for it, and we're stressed out.
Right.
And, then back to the cyber sleuthing. It was interesting to me, speaking of the cyber sleuthing, like, there are a lot of things in this book that like the book gets completely wrong from a technical perspective that like even 3 or 4 years after the book came out would be obsolete. But some of the issues that they get to are like super relevant, like even today, like
privacy,
net neutrality, that the actions of or the effect of money on the internet.
Right,
it definitely is reacting to something real that was happening at the time and has continued to happen, which is the closing off of the Wild West.
Right.
And also the broification of tech culture.
Yes.
Like, I think that's sort of the big sorrow at the heart of the book, in fact, is seeing like all of these rebels who pioneered this getting pushed out.
Yes, and that's where sort of, the thing that makes the book kind of sad to read now is that it ends on this hopeful note of, maybe through queer solidarity we can, like hold on to our space. And
if there, I should point out that there is still space.
That's true. There's still space on the internet. There's still spaces on the internet. But like the idea of sort of like hanging on to, like, a lot of the old internet is just gone, and a lot of it that's good.
Yes.
And a lot of it that's also sad.
I mean, the kind of old internet that is represented by the mayor is also mostly gone.
Right,
and that's good.
That is good.
Oh man, I want to
So
talk.
the question is that gone, or is it just that now that we're adults, we don't run into that anymore?
Oh, it's like I think that.
Because I wonder.
I mean, I feel like there's certainly still, there's definitely grooming on the internet. There's still slime on the internet. There's still, abuse and what is it? I mean, there's plenty of the sort of ancillary things that could be, but there's that particular kind of like gatekeeping, bigoted old guard,
old grognard who
I was going to say grognard and then I didn't, so thank you for saying grognard.
Welcome.
That generation seems to have either moved into the weeds, or maybe they're all off on like Mastodon, or maybe in the other direction on some BBS that we mere mortals would never think to access. But they're certainly not present in the spaces that I have mixed in.
That's true. I mean, again, part of that is what we're mixing in different spaces these days. But I mean, that specific kind of guy, yeah, not so much anymore that I've seen. But I mean, part of that's a generational thing. That guy is there. I would not be surprised if there's people who are like within our age, or maybe up to 10 years older, who are that guy for a new generation, including with the gatekeeping and stuff. I mean, probably they're not all, probably they're not all men, and probably a lot of it is actually sort of preying on vulnerable teens in like social justice spaces. But that much is certainly true. And I mean, it's also just like, this is human behavior, right.
People are people.
Right. But it is true that the mayor is such a portrait of an internet guy who is fortunately not around nearly so much anymore.
Right. I mean, the major reason that this book no longer, one of the major ways that this book's timeline deviates from ours is the barrier to entry to the internet has fallen so fast, right, and so thoroughly.
In this book, the barrier to entry to the internet has sort of become harder and harder.
Right. In this book, you need to have a designated person in your art co-op to connect your printer to the internet.
Right. Yes, and still everybody to have even like very basic internet connectivity has to have surgery, has to have like a surgical implant. Right. The brain, so like, because even the non-brainworm people still have like the slot.
Yes. So it didn't turn out that way, for better or for worse.
Yes.
But
it is sort of
interesting. Like,
this book just did not predict at all.
Yeah. But it is sort of interesting because like the sort of the dynamic between Trouble, the mayor, and Starling, the cops, basically. Mm-hmm. It's like on every world, the mayor and Trouble should be natural allies against Starling, right?
Right. Because
and that's almost the central tragedy of the book, right? Gee, how come your mom lets your book have two central tragedies?
Is that if it weren't for his, homophobia and like gatekeepiness, the mayor has lost a core of powerful allies. Because and you're right. And part of the central tragedy is also that like Trouble has to. This is not a pro cops book, but it still's like sometimes when you're a vulnerable minority, you still actually got to ally with the cops because sometimes the other people out there are worse.
Yeah, and it's like, she does it holding her nose.
She does it holding her nose, and she does. It does not, like I said, this is not a pro cop book. Trouble's not a pro cop person. The ending, where she makes a deal with the cops, is still, the denouement is them being annoyed at her because she's not doing the things that they were hoping she would do. And she's like, what did you expect?
Right.
But they were
It's sort of
still
acknowledging that you have to go into the light a little bit to be a real thorn in the side of the powers that be, if you see what I mean.
right. And I mean, and actually, one of the ways in which this is prescient is that like the dark web is full of terrible people, and just the mayor kind of represents the dark web.
Yes.
And like the dark web continues to be full of terrible people. I think these days we're actually more aware of how many terrible people there are on it. And like just how much, drugs and child pornography and things that are, and like, and like serious organized crime drugs, not just the local weed dealer or whatever. And that, sometimes, because if you can't work at all with the cops, then sometimes, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely independent. Sometimes it just means that you end up working with organized crime.
Yeah. I mean, which they do in this book.
Right, exactly.
Also.
And so, like, part of the challenge for Trouble and Cerise throughout the book is, you've got your giant corporations, you've got your organized crime, you've got your cops, and like none of them are good. And how on earth do you chart a path between all of these things without falling into the clutches of any of them?
Right. And your anti-authoritarian hacker, who's in charge of the safe internet space turns out to be a right-wing libertarian shithead.
Right, exactly.
And so that's not good either. So,
PayPal was founded by Peter Thiel, but we still use it to send money to our poor queer friends. It's a means to an end.
Trouble and her friends have to find their own space, or actually remake the space that used to belong to the right-wing libertarian shithead.
Yes.
It's not perfect, because nothing ever is, but at least to have something in the face of all of these other powers, which aren't going away because they're, they run along separate rules. The 90s cyberpunk genre in general was right about how corporations would be, incidentally. It turns out that's one thing that they were right about.
Sort of. I mean, they're not... Corporations have not taken the place of the state in a way that that Cyberpunk has tended to assume that they would.
That's true.
Cyberpunk tended to assume that everything would be like Japanese, Korean style giant conglomerates, and I mean we still have a lot of giant conglomerates, but there's more. And the internet actually, in some ways, has become that. The internet. Really, state power has been pretty much been replaced by like 5 mega corporations. But the real, meat space, as it were, there's still some chat. Like we're not actually living in a place where your corporate employee ID means more than your citizenship.
That's actually hilarious. What does Marx and William Gibson have in common is that they both predicted the withering away of the state incorrectly, as it turns out.
Yes.
Yeah, it turns out it's hard to, any kind of large entrenched power structure is really difficult to shift if it's intent on keeping itself alive and has an army.
Yes.
But...
And,
anyway.
Actually, nationalism is not quite as easy to unseat as...
Oh, that's the thing that we were the most wrong about in the 90s. Holy shit.
Yeah. I mean, and another thing that is just about his predictions, like Trouble and Her Friends gets wrong, is that corporate culture has really loosened up. Like, one of the things, and this is actually the biggest thing I think that Trouble and Her Friends gets wrong, is that it assumes that, and this is again where it's actually kind of prescient for the Wizard vs. Lesbian genre, it assumes that being queer is going to remain being a revolutionary thing and really misses out on the way that corporations have co-opted a wide variety of queer identities.
Show this author Pride Month, and it's a very different book,
Right. I mean, the thing is, it's not that
Rainbow
there weren't...
capitalism.
Right. And the thing is that, like, it's not that there wasn't already some of that in the 90s. I just read a fascinating and hilarious article about, like, how Subaru started appealing to lesbians as a deliberate marketing strategy.
I saw that. I saw that too.
Definitely worth reading.
I remember those old ads. Yeah.
Right. Actually, great article. Strongly recommend reading it.
The article in question is called How an Ad Campaign Made Lesbians Fall in Love with Subaru, and it's at priceonomics.com. Meanwhile, this cool cyberpunk audio bed is from a 2006 Subaru commercial. Find it on YouTube.
You know, so like that sort of thing. But one of the interesting things about reading that article was that when Subaru was doing this, it was actually a risky strategy. Corporations were getting like genuine pushback if they had ads with gay people in them. And also that part of the push to do this apparently was telling the corporation, well, we're going to, if we want to make these ads work, we're also going to have to start offering domestic partner health benefits. And these days we ask less and less of the follow through. I mean, like, there'll be a brief flurry of getting angry when it's discovered that some corporation is, funding some anti-trans legislation, and then everybody forgets about it.
Yes, indeed. But let's not spend this discussing our dystopia. Let's move back to the dystopia posited in this book.
And that is, in the dystopia posited in this book, homophobia and sexism and racism. It's funny because I want to say, like, remain prevalent, and it's not that they don't remain prevalent here, today in our dystopia, but the way in which a lot of the casual racism, sexism, and homophobia of the 80s and 90s is no longer mainstream. It's something that this book is one of the few areas where this book is less optimistic.
Yes, exactly.
Also, AIDS. This is a fascinating thing it's a fascinating thing about reading Cyberpunk, where you read Cyberpunk and you remember just how big and terrifying AIDS was until like 2 years after this book came out.
Right, and this is set hundreds of years in the future.
No, it's not. It's set like 20 years in the future.
No. It is set like there was a big gap which included a giant climate thing which lasted for like 100 years. This is set significantly.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Because this feels like it's set in like that. That's definitely a thing where this book is less successful.
Correct. But anyway, yes, it posits that people who are queer are more likely to be getting the brainworm, and thus it sort of makes the brainworm a metaphor for queerness, because queerness inherently sort of radically challenges the idea that the body is sacrosanct or a sort of cohesive natural whole, which, great observation from the 90s.
Yes.
And very much in line with both the Wizards vs. Lesbian stuff and with the trans stuff.
Right, and it does sort of point out the ways in which, queerness can sort of make it easier, that it manages to capture part of what makes the internet so appealing to queer people, which is the chance to start sort of feeling out and shaping your identity beyond your own body.
Yeah. And so Silk is a very interesting character.
Silk is an interesting character. Oh, I guess we should add content. Should we add content warning of like fridging the vulnerable young, not fridging, but like the tragic death of a vulnerable young queer kid?
Nah.
Okay.
I think that we should expect that to come with the territory. But but it's like, even though, it's not, made textually explicit that this is a queer kid, it's clearly a queer kid, right?
Silk is clearly a queer kid, because Silk has had cyber sex with both men and women, and both a male and female avatar. But even like set aside the male and female avatar, just like based on his sexual experiences. If you want to go all 90s, his based on the Kinsey scale.
Right.
Now they're also an AMAB person on the internet, calling themselves Silk. It doesn't take a genius to figure that one out.
There's a thing we don't talk about
I think
anymore.
there's a Gold Star lesbian reference in this book too, isn't there?
I think there
if
might
I recall
be, yeah.
correctly. Yeah, but not in those terms. But it's Trouble sort of mutters about Cerise being like, we wouldn't get into this trouble if you just didn't date men. But but yeah, no, this kid is clearly a queer kid, and he sort of represents that kind of potential future of the internet. Like, it's obvious that Trouble and the mayor are fighting over the future of the internet as it is embodied in this kid,
yes.
right?
And by kid we mean like 17 or 18, so not a child, but still a kid.
Yeah. And that, the mayor is like, funding the kid and keeping him in his house because he wants him to be a certain kind of person, and doesn't know that he's on the wire, doesn't know that this kid is gay.
Well, and like he sees this kid, and this is very much like, he sees himself in this kid because it's young male nerdy hacker type, and as so many in our generation, as it has turned out, so often, that person actually wasn't necessarily a young man. And certainly wasn't straight.
Exactly. And yeah, when we talk about, that's the most wizardy thing the mayor does. The wizard does many mayory things, including
the mayor does many wizardy things, you mean?
Yes, the wizard does many mayory things. The mayor does many wizardy things. Well, the reason that got twisted up in my head was that I was going to say the mayor is actually the Wizard of Oz in certain respects.
Yes.
It's like, building this labyrinth of illusion around him being just a guy in an apartment.
Right.
Kind of a deal, which you finally get to see through, which is, what does him in.
Right. I mean, I love the moment where, he's, Trouble's gone in to talk with him because he's, threatened them all with nukes, and he's like, wow, I can't believe you came. And she's like, well, you did threaten everyone with nukes. And he's like, that's not possible. You are a hacker too.
Oh yeah, but he spends his final moments on Earth like just being like, it's not even. You should have known that's not possible. Are you so stupid that you don't even understand that basic thing, you woman?
Right, exactly. When actually the thing that
gatekeeping to the last.
Gatekeeping to the last.
If he was smart enough, he would have known that it's a double bluff, right?
Right, and also, yes, gatekeeping to the last. And part of why Trouble and Cerise are even willing to consider this is that they're like, on the one hand, we know that intellectually this shouldn't be possible. On the other hand, they do kind of buy into this guy's mystique a little bit. And they're like, well, if anybody could do it, it would be the mayor.
But it's also that, he demonstrates that he is willing, like our wizards are, to end the world if his ideology and his way of living in the world will not continue.
Right.
That's why he kills the kid.
Yes.
It's like, if I can't control the future of the internet, there will be no future of the internet. And I am certain that in a sort of Putin-y way, if he had access to nukes,
if he had access to nukes, then right. And part of why Trouble and Cerise are willing to take his bluff seriously is that, first, there is this sort of buying a little bit into his mystique of, if anybody could manage to hack the local nukes, it would be him. But there's also, if anybody would manage to hack the local nukes, it would and actually use it, it would be this guy. He's very wizardy. He takes in this homeless kid, grooms this homeless kid to be, the next generation of gatekeeping grognard.
Oh, little grognard, it originally referred to veterans of Napoleon's Waterloo campaign. But in English it's pronounced grognard, and it means people who are very into Warhammer 30k, mostly old crusty nerds.
And then murders this kid, and then like takes care of this kid for several years.
Yes.
Takes in this homeless teenager until he's like 17 or 8, when he's like 14, and takes care of him until he's like 17 or 18, and then just casually murders him when he finds out that he's got the brainworm implant / is gay.
Yeah.
Like that's a wizard. Plus the fact that
right
plus the fact that he's obsessed with controlling, the way that he's super obsessed with controlling like everybody's space in his little cyberspace thing, where he'll just on random whims be like, today everyone's avatars must be realistic, no 2D avatars.
Right. And the way that he doesn't like, no swearing.
Right.
It is, he wants to control not only, who has access to his space, but what kind of self-expression, what kind of language, what kind of culture can exist within his space.
Right.
So yeah, no, 100%.
And also the fact that, no matter what, sometimes Sea Haven is an old Western town, and sometimes Sea Haven is, a night market or whatever. But no matter what, there's like this giant ziggurat in the middle of it, which is where the mayor lives.
Yeah.
Where the mayor
what's
lives.
A wizard without a tower?
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. I mean, like he really is a wizard, and just a cyber wizard instead of a, pointy hat and stars wizard.
Indeed.
Actually, I will note one of the things that this book gets somewhat wrong in terms of aesthetic, but kind of correct in reality, is the way that education ends up becoming this sort of 2-track, where there's like real universities that are prestigious, and then there's stuff that's just training you that's vocational training for jobs that are way oversubscribed.
Yeah, didn't get the mechanism quite right.
Didn't get the mechanism quite right, but like
the fact is certainly there. Yeah. Do you have anything else about the book that you wanted to discuss before we head into Grumpy Zone?
Yeah, a couple things. Mostly brief notes. I like the sort of, I like the gay Interpol guy, where it's like, well, a gay cop is still a cop, but also a gay cop can, be a little bit more receptive, like at least can be a little bit more receptive. I like how nuanced this book is in dealing with the police.
Yes.
And also the idea that like there's different cops. There's, you can kind of play different jurisdictions against each other.
Yeah, fool the police, fool the police, fool the police.
It's
certainly a more practical viewpoint than ACAB.
Right, it's a very sort of pragmatic and nuanced view of the police, which does not in any way buy into the idea that the police are inherently good or there to protect us.
It doesn't excuse their behavior or think that they're right or any of that, but it's like, well, you're going to have to deal with them probably. You can't actually just, destroy or ignore them. So here are some ideas.
Right, exactly. So, that I liked. Also, I know this is coming back to Silk, but I really, the way that Trouble, really sees herself, like the way that I really enjoyed how this, for a long time, Silk / Neo Trouble is this, antagonist, and they're out to get him. And they know that Neo Trouble is this like punk kid, because grown-ass adult would be acting like this. But as soon as they like put the pieces together, and they're like, oh, actually when we say punk kid, we mean vulnerable queer youth. Like,
right.
They, and just the way that like crystallizes in Trouble's mind, and she almost immediately switches from, I want to take this kid down, to, oh, that was me, 15 years ago. I thought that was very well depicted. The way that people can, people can get sort of very antagonistic, but when you see somebody in a different light and like realize and can see yourself and when you were young and stupid in them, suddenly, all of that hostility can turn into protectiveness. And that was, I don't know, I just thought that was well depicted.
Agreed. Yeah. Do we know ultimate?
Sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask whether we ultimately know whether the mayor put the kid up to taking on the Trouble moniker as a sort of a pretext to getting rid of Trouble.
My impression is no. My impression is that the mayor encouraged the kid to get up to Trouble, but didn't like give specific ideas because Trouble had disappeared off the internet. I think it was more that the mayor encouraged the kid to cause havoc so long as it was the kind of havoc that and that wasn't that the mayor could approve of.
The right kind of havoc, yeah, not
The
gay
right kind of havoc.
No queer havoc, straight havoc. I liked that whole thing a lot. I think that was one of the better, one of the more interesting things in a book that was already very interesting.
Yes. Also, the whole thing where you make you make all your queer internet friends and then you all move to the same city, and you all sort of end up like hanging out a subway ride away so that you can hang out in person. That was very, I thought, well depicted.
I mean, I only hope that kids these days are able to find the economic fortitude or
I mean, these days I'm not sure they're all moving to the same city,
that off at all. But yeah, cities, we can't afford to live in cities anymore.
Well, yeah, that's another thing that all Cyberpunk got wrong.
In this one, it's a tiny little town. Yeah. Maybe it is in fact Hampton, New Hampshire, that all of the queer kids can go to.
No, because they're not all living in Sea Haven. They're all living somewhere where there's a subway right away, until Evans Tyndale passes, and then Trouble runs off to live on an art commune.
Yeah, pour one out for the possibilities of communal urban living. Also,
yeah. Well, that's another thing that Cyberpunk got wrong, is that Cyberpunk expected that white flight would continue and the cities would remain dystopias, and they did not predict gentrification.
Indeed. If only they could have prevented it.
They just didn't make the cities seem hellish enough. They made them seem too cool.
I mean, actually, to be fair, Snow Crash was set entirely in suburban, post-apocalyptic hellscapes. I don't think there was even much in the way of cities in that book, but
it's hard to tell.
Enormous digression.
Snow Crash.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right.
Yes.
So the complaining zone.
Yep, it's the complaining zone. Yeah. Not much. Most of it's really nitpicky. The book really drags a little bit when Cerise and Trouble are both making their way to Sea Haven.
Mm-hmm.
Too much time is spent, I think, on the description of driving to a small town in New Hampshire.
That's reasonable. It's a little. If I'm gonna nitpick, my biggest nitpick is that the time skip is only like 3 years, but it doesn't feel like 3 years. It feels like 10 years.
Yeah,
like,
I think that
my life has changed drastically over the last 2.5 years, and I don't look back at 3 years ago with that sort of the misty past way that everybody in this book seems to look at their 3 years ago. Now, admittedly, this has been a particularly unusual couple of years for the world, but still, I think that the time skip would have worked better if it had been 5 to 10 years instead of making it be 3 years.
Yeah, there are a bunch of things with duration that the book is not quite.
The book is it's very fuzzy on time. And
yeah. This isn't actually a complaint, but I just thought it was interesting that it uses it as a gender neutral pronoun.
Yeah.
Without it being sort of I don't think it's an insult, although they only use it when they're talking about this, cyber entity that they can't gender.
But it doesn't feel like an insult. It feels like a proto they.
It's just sort of interesting that's the call that they made for it rather than they.
Yeah, it's making me wonder. Well, I mean, the thing is, they is a widely agreed upon term for. Probably because it might have been an effort to make it sound more futuristic, because we actually just use singular they to talk about unknown people. Mm-hmm. We always did, and if you want to make it seem a little bit more like cybery and dehumanized, because normally we think of using it as a gender-neutral pronoun for people. These days, it's the dehumanization of transphobia. But in this case, I think it's supposed to be the dehumanization of cyberspace.
There's this is the nittiest of nitpicks, but there is a bit where Trouble is watching a cartoon, which is definitely supposed to be Aeon Flux, and she mentions that the director is a woman, and it wasn't. Aeon Flux was directed by Peter Chung.
It is possible that this is supposed to be that was a deliberate choice. Like,
I'm certain it was, but I just want to give a shout out to Peter Chung for not only for Aeon Flux, but for his Alexander the Great anime, which is both of which are some of the weirdest and gayest animations that that have been created. And so I just I wanted to give him his due there.
The Alexander the Great anime is called Reign the Conqueror. I recommend watching it. It's one of the weirdest and gayest things you'll ever see. It's also worth noting that Peter Chung, creator of Aeon Flux, was also one of the primary character designers for Rugrats.
This is actually not a complaint at all, but shout out to the whole, shout out to like the little side note about like when she's like looking at some random hacker's room and being like, oh, there's a bunch of anime here. Yep, this is definitely some random internet nerd. It's like, and, it is nice to know that
some things never change.
Some things never change. So
okay, one actual complaint.
Yeah,
the characters smile too much in this book. They smile to express every emotion, whether that emotion is wry or deadpan.
That's
which
true.
Are pretty
There's a
most
lot
of
of
the emotions. That
right. It's true.
I mean, but it's the 90s.
It's very 90s. Everything is just as either a wry smile or deadpan. But yeah, no, the writing can be clunky occasionally, and that is one of the places. This isn't actually a complaint, but I think it is a really interesting decision that they never actually do get into what the heck is up with Cerise's boss. Like,
yeah,
there's this idea, there's this hint, like there's this whole thing where part of why, they're willing that Trouble and Cerise are able to play Interpol off against the Treasury is that, Interpol is like, I think one of those two groups is more interested in figuring out what the heck is up with Cerise's boss, and we never do figure it out. He's kind of a slime ball, but we don't know how or why.
Yeah, and like in the same way we don't get closure on what exactly it was that the mayor wanted with the kid, although we can infer.
I thought it was a really interesting choice to like very to say, like, to have this relationship brought up and have people go, oh, well, clearly it's sexual, and to go, no, we thought it was, and we've done extensive research, and we have definitely ascertained that this is not a sexual relationship between this older guy and this, like, teenage boy.
Right, and it's
this is just a creepy grooming relationship that is not sexual, and we don't know if it's not sexual because, like, the older guy is too repressed and self-loathing or afraid or whatever, or if it's just not sexual because he's actually straight. But whatever is going on, it is way weirder and creepier than just flat out, like, pedophilia.
Yeah, and it's like, I think that it's partially the book is like, okay, we're not going to do the trope where it's like the predatory older, repressed gay man, because that's been overdone, but we are going to acknowledge that that's a thing.
Right.
That exists. We're not going to whitewash it either.
Right. I mean, I think it's not just that it's been overdone. I think it's also like, this is partially a book about like the revolutionary power of being queer. It's not even queer desire. It's just of like being queer. And that, and so, I mean, a lot of books would still make the villain gay anyway. And I think it's a really deliberate choice to have the villain be like all of these stereotypes of a predatory gay man, but explicitly not gay.
Or at least explicitly not actively,
like,
possibly dealing with some with internalized homophobia.
Yeah, we'll never know. Like, we don't really know anything that's going on in like the mayor's heart because it doesn't actually matter.
It's weird. I'm wondering if this is like, this isn't a connection that it would have occurred to me to make before we read this book in The Fortunate Fall. But again, like the way that this ends is very noir, in much the same way that the way that Fortunate Fall ends is very noir. And I'm wondering, like, if Cyberpunk is not also just sort of a noir revival with, implants and
it super is. I mean,
jacking into the mainframe.
No, it super is. Think about Blade Runner, which is basically like, the the birth of Cyberpunk.
This is obviously something that should have occurred to me long ago,
right.
but it never occurred to me to make the explicit connection.
I mean, part of it is that a lot of Cyberpunk, clearly, especially later Cyberpunk, got really excited about the aesthetic and didn't actually seem to notice that this is noir. And one of the things I think that The Fortunate Fall and Trouble and Her Friends do is they actually, dig back into the noir roots of Cyberpunk in a way that, like, the Blade Runner does, and that William Gibson does at first and then sort of does less and less. Like, Neuromancer is pretty noiry, but they get less and less noiry with every book he writes.
As the more he gets excited about actual physical objects in the world,
right.
and like how fancy and expensive they are, the less noir it gets. Much like, tech culture as a whole. But also, since we're mentioning the actual noir roots of Cyberpunk, we mentioned Blade Runner, Philip K. Dick, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
His shadow is long.
Truly, Dick casts a long shadow over us all.
Right. Is that it? Have we completed our inventory here?
I think so. I think, you guys, but seriously, guys, read Trouble and Her Friends. I want to just end on a note, which is one time I saw somebody talking on Twitter about, she'd written her dissertation on, like, lesbian spec fic. Sadly, I have lost this person's information, or I would, contact her now. But, and she made a comment about, how exciting it was for her dissertation or master's thesis or undergrad honors thesis, I don't even remember, to get to read this lesbian cyberpunk. And I messaged her and I was like, are you talking about Trouble and Her Friends? Because at the time I had not heard of The Fortunate Fall. And she was like, I am! I'm so glad somebody else has heard of this book. And so, it is great that we've gotten to come back to the book that everyone thinks of as the lesbian cyberpunk book. But let's also take a moment to be sad that The Fortunate Fall did not, has been lost to time.
It's been lost to time.
Like tears in the rain, as it were.
Well, so this was a nice little break.
This is a nice little break. And next week, are you going to do it?
Book called...
Are you going to make it through it?
Yes, I'm going to make it through it. We're going to do a book called Battle of the Linguist Mages. And the last time that Alexis read something and immediately said to me, like, oh God, this is awful, we have to read it immediately, that was
Uncommon Flight from Uncommon Stars, which I have to say,
turns out that I loved.
I have to say, Battle of the Linguist Mages is so fascinatingly awful that it has, in retrospect, made me way more charitable towards A Light from Uncommon Stars, which, for whatever its flaws, has genuine heart.
Yes, I have started to read Battle of the Linguist Mages. It is... Tune in next time, everybody.
It is a ride and a half. All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. So long.
Bye.